From the studios at WMFE in Orlando, Florida, this is the Space Exploration Podcast, asking the question, are we there yet? It was good news, bad news week when it comes to Mars exploration. On one hand, SpaceX announced plans to launch a Dragon spacecraft to Mars as early as 2018. But on the other hand, NASA scaled back funding for a critical landing demonstration needed for a Mars landing. While it might be a setback for NASA, Casey Dreier, he's the head of space policy for the Planetary Society, thinks there's a lesson to be learned here. When it comes to Mars, you've got to have a plan. Casey joins me via Skype to talk about a piece he wrote for the Planetary Society, aptly titled, What NASA Can Learn from SpaceX, A Man, a Plan, Mars. So Casey, as you say in your piece, good news, bad news when it comes to Mars. So let's start with the good. Tell me about the SpaceX announcement that came last week.
Well, SpaceX, has this core goal, right? They don't just want to launch rockets to low Earth orbit. They want to colonize Mars, or at least Elon Musk says his goal is to retire on Mars. And they take this very seriously. And they made the first announcement of what we anticipate will be more details coming out later this year about how their company plans to start developing the technology and creating the missions that'll send people to Mars. So earlier this week, they said that they will start sending in 2018 the Dragon space capsule, the version 2 that they're already developing to send up to the International Space Station. They want to start lobbing that one out to Mars and to attempt to land on the surface of Mars using this supersonic retro propulsion that they're developing to safely land humans back on Earth. So it's a series of technology demonstrations really to start figuring out how they can operate in deep space and how they can land on Mars without using parachutes.
Did you expect it to come this soon, being 2018?
I think that, SpaceX always takes a really aggressive schedule, so it doesn't surprise me. I didn't have a heads up exactly when they were going to announcement, but 2018, it's not just any special time to launch to Mars. It's a particularly good time to launch to Mars, and so it's you have a particularly good alignment between Mars and the Earth. You can send more mass for less fuel. And it was originally targeted as one of NASA's major Mars missions before it was canceled back in 2012. And the Europeans are going, so it seemed like a good time to do something with Mars in 2018.
Because if not, you have to wait about, another 2 years till 2020?
Yeah, every 26 months you launch to Mars. The Earth and Mars have to align in a particular way to really maximize your fuel usage. And so you don't want to just launch at any time. You have these windows. And this is why it's always tough. NASA just had this earlier this year. They wanted to launch what was called InSight, a scientific lander to land on Mars. And because of an instrumentation problem with one of European instruments that they were going to put on this mission, they couldn't make the launch window. And so they have to wait now until the 2018 launch window to send InSight over there. So you have a very narrow opportunity to launch to Mars. If you miss it, you got to wait 26 months.
So you kind of spoke briefly about this, and this is all speculation at this point, but what would a Mars mission look like? What do you think that they have the capability to do, and how would they go about doing it?
Well, for SpaceX, this initial one, I think these are really seen as kind of technology demonstration, trying to figure things out. So I kind of liken this to how they've been building up their capability to fly back the first stage booster of the Falcon 9 after launching something into low Earth orbit. They failed 5 times in a row, I think, before they finally started to land. And this is something I anticipate, this is not going to be the final crew. I think Elon Musk even said this on Twitter. This is not going to be the final configuration of how they want to send people to Mars. This is really just to start figuring out how to land large amounts of mass on the surface. There's another interesting thing about this. This Dragon 2 space capsule, so it's going to be uncrewed. There'll be no people on it. It weighs about, I think, 6,000 pounds, or at least in the thousands of pounds. NASA's biggest mission that it has ever sent to Mars was the Curiosity rover, and that clocked in about 1,000 pounds. Wow. So this is a substantially larger mass to land, and that's a hard thing to do, and they're landing in a new way, and so this is a series of technology demonstrations to try to figure out how to do that.
And you can't land in the traditional sense or the terrestrial sense, we can say, right? You can't use parachutes on Mars. They're trying to use these thrusters, right? How's that going to work?
Yeah, well, Mars it's like the worst of all possible worlds for for it to land on. You have an atmosphere, so you can't, at least up until now, you haven't been able to just use rockets to land like we did on the moon. You have a thin atmosphere, so you can't slow down enough to just use parachutes. And so every mission that NASA has sent, and the Russians have attempted to land, you have a combination of using parachutes and rockets. Parachutes slow you down to a certain degree, rockets slow you down the rest of the way. And now you have these like sky crane cool configurations to drop big payloads on the surface. To just use rockets like SpaceX wants to do, you have to use rockets at a really high speed at a very thin level of atmosphere. And so far, that has never really been done. And actually, Eric Berger at Ars Technica just wrote a few days after this announcement that SpaceX has actually quietly been testing this with its own Falcon 9 first stage reusable rocket test that they've been doing. It's been firing its rocket at a really high altitude above Earth at a level where your Mars atmosphere would be a similar sort of density as the Earth's atmosphere that you're dealing with. So they've actually been playing with this rockets in really thin atmospheres, seeing how they function, seeing the performance they can get out of that. And this is the advantage, I think, this is the point that I make in my article, of having this long-term plan. It gives them a guidance and it gives them a focus for every technology that they're using right now. They have an eye on Mars, and how this technology they develop now is going to play into that. And if you can solve a problem now in a way that steps you towards your Mars goal, so much the better. And SpaceX has been very good at this.
You alluded to the second half of your thesis in that article where there was good news and there's also bad news as well. Tell me about what happened with NASA this week.
So NASA has, it's broken up into a bunch of large directorates in terms of its programmatic structure. One of these things is called the Science and Technology Mission Directorate, the STMD, for all your acronym fans at home. The STMD, was created to start developing these, brand new game-changing technologies, particularly in propulsion and life support. That was the original envisioned kind of goal of this. And it's always been very hard to get Congress to fund it at the levels that the administration has requested, because it doesn't really have a clear project. It has lots of small projects, right? And just conceptually, that makes it kind of easy to pick at. But one of the projects they were working on was called the Large Supersonic Decelerator, or the Low Density Supersonic Decelerator, the LDSD, again, for all your acronym fans. And the idea was that they've been actually testing this the last few years. They would launch into low Earth orbit, a small pseudo spacecraft that would then inflate into a really large heat shield to try to slow things down. So you didn't have to bring as much mass with you, but you can inflate and slow it. This is the whole problem of landing on Mars, right?
Right.
You need to slow down enough so you can land without burning up on reentry. And so this was a test program to start landing larger and larger payloads on the surface. That was basically slashed into, it wasn't quite canceled, but it went down to just stasis level. I think it went $20 million a year to $3 million a year, just enough to keep a few people on the project. And that happened because there just wasn't enough money in what Congress gave NASA last year to pursue every project they wanted to do in their Space Technology Mission Directorate. And it just served as this interesting kind of corollary or complement to SpaceX having this clear plan. It has to prioritize technologies that get it to Mars. NASA, despite its kind of rhetoric that it wants to go to Mars, which is great, doesn't have a clear plan. It hasn't committed to a path that's going to take it there. And so how does it choose to prioritize which technologies to invest in? Is the low-density supersonic decelerator a critical piece of technology that NASA will need to land humans on Mars? Well, maybe. And that's why it was, should it have fought for it more? We don't know, because we don't know what NASA is going to try to do to send humans to Mars. And that's the problem of not having a clear plan. You don't have this goal to help direct your investments now. And this is kind of the problem that NASA's been facing. Despite its Journey to Mars rhetoric, it doesn't know exactly how it's going to do it. And that ultimately, I argue, and the Planetary Society argues, that's ultimately does a disservice to NASA.
I mean, do you think that NASA's still just in that incubation stage of this idea and they're still trying to lay it out? Or are they really just going into this blind and there's no plan for a plan?
That's a hard question, and I hesitate to assign NASA. I mean, it's always, again, there's a couple of subtleties that we always have to appreciate, right? That NASA is a federal agency, right? And has many inputs into its direction. It's not just Congress. You have the White House. You have the Office of Management and Budget. You have the Office of Science and Technology Policy. You have the National Academy of Sciences. You have the NASA Advisory Council. often you get all these kind of conflicting directions, about what NASA should be doing. And plus you have folks like us, the chorus of people who love NASA and tell them this is the way, our armchair NASA administrators. But it's hard because I think NASA has been burned before. I think this is something that is important to know. Past efforts, particularly the Constellation program, that was a clear plan. And almost immediately people saw that NASA was falling behind on their plan to go to the moon. And that made that program ripe for cancellation when a new president came in, because people could point to it and say, look, this is not going according to plan. It's not going to work. It's going to be too expensive, or, all of these kind of issues with Constellation. And that undermined that commitment for the next administration. You go back to 1989 when George H.W. Bush tried to put forward the space exploration initiative to go back to the moon permanently, to go to Mars, and then they put a price tag on it, and that just killed the program. And so there's a in a sense there's a political advantage of not having a clear plan, because you can't hold NASA to the fact that it's behind, because you don't know what it's behind or if it's on track or not. You don't know what the budget is, so you can't criticize them for the budget. This is the essence of this capabilities-driven approach, which is actually kind of mandated by the 2010 NASA Authorization Act by Congress. You build the capability, you build the heavy lift rocket, you build your deep space capsule, and then you start using it. So in a way, it's kind of by design, but also, my guess would be NASA would love to put more details in, but at a certain point, they're an executive branch agency, and if the White House does not sign off on this larger commitment, they can't talk about it. So my feeling is, and this is just my opinion, that you might be seeing hesitation at the upper levels of the White House about committing NASA to a major program and a major expenditure of funds, particularly at this point in time. And that all may be coming into play in this interesting mix of what a democratic society, asks of its discretionary spending agencies.
Yeah, and with an election looming, just over the horizon, I mean, how much does that play into it? Are they just keeping quiet and making sure that they, please the next administrator that comes in? Is that what you're saying?
I have to think that that's part of their thinking right now. And you will see this. I think we saw this with the president's budget request just came out for 2017. Notably, this president will no longer be president for 2017. The budget that we saw did not really change anything, right? It was kind of just kept everything stable, mild boost to NASA, which was nice, at least that they're going in that right direction. But nothing, really huge. And of course, because the next president's going to come in, NASA doesn't want to start a major new initiative now on the off chance that the next administration will just nix that whole thing. And even there's, these real political considerations. Does NASA want to start a major program right now and have it tied to the previous president, and then you have another president of a different political party come in? Will they want to continue their opposition's big goal in space? Maybe, maybe not. And so there's kind of strategic, thinking about how much you want to tie the politics of, kind of the larger political process to the programs at NASA. And you really don't want to tie that too heavily, particularly right next to a transition. The next president will want to make a mark on NASA, and you don't want to have it tied too much to the history of the last administration.
Gotcha. Well, let's go back to this this Mars shot. With SpaceX making this launch and NASA obviously almost a decade behind, they are planning on sharing some information, correct? And SpaceX is going to give them some landing data?
Yeah, it goes both ways. So they have a Space Act agreement. There's no exchange of funds, which is everyone's, particularly NASA's, I'm sure, favorite type of Space Act agreement. NASA will donate basically time of civil servants. They'll donate their data. They will provide communications access on the Deep Space Network. They will provide access to the orbiting satellites around Mars that'll serve as data relays for anything on the surface. And in turn, SpaceX has guaranteed to share with NASA everything it learns about trying to land Dragon on the surface of Mars using the supersonic retropropulsion. And so it's a nice it's basically, SpaceX gets to leverage some of the infrastructure that NASA has built up for communicating in deep space, and NASA gets some free practice data or attempts of just seeing how this new technology could work, and that'll inform, I'm sure, NASA's thinking if it decides to keep Mars as the focus through the next administration.
Do you think SpaceX can pull this off?
I hope they do. I mean, not a lot of history really to pull from. Here's the things. Two things have to happen that haven't happened yet, right? They need to launch the Falcon Heavy. So this mission depends on the Falcon Heavy being there to be used.
Which has been delayed so far.
It's been delayed by many years at this point. And SpaceX, I believe, has said that they plan to launch the first test of the Falcon Heavy late this year, I think in September, November. We need to see them do this. And we need to have the Dragon version 2 also has to be ready. That's being developed with a large part for NASA's Commercial Crew program, where they have a deadline of 2017, I believe late 2017, if my memory serves me correctly. And so, SpaceX is very well known for having aggressive dates that has historically not made. And so, again, Mars waits for no man, no Musk, no SpaceX, no anybody. Mars will be in alignment, and then it'll be out of alignment. And if they don't make that deadline in 2018, they'll have to wait 2 years. And so I think there's this, technologically speaking, I see no reason why they can't. It's just the timing. That's the thing that I'm most, I think, skeptical is maybe too strong a word about, but that's going to be the core challenge for SpaceX, is to hit the timing of this.
That 2018 window, how wide is it? Are we talking weeks, months, days when it comes around?
I don't know exactly. It's usually on the order of weeks. So 3 to 4 weeks. And again, it depends on how strong your rocket is. So Falcon Heavy, if it's at, the capability they say it is, that might give them a little extra leeway. But I would say no more than 6 week window. And that really kind of depends. It changes a little bit every time based on the general configuration of where Earth and Mars are together. And again, I also, Bobby Braun, who was the former chief technologist at NASA, just spoke out in the press a few days ago saying that he believes technologically SpaceX totally can achieve this. But again, it really depends on the timing. And I think that's going to be the primary challenge.
With this whole, ambitious goal of putting people on Mars, these are steps in that direction. Who do you think is going to get there first? Is it going to be a national space organization or a private space organization?
I think we're seeing increasingly that it's going to be some hybrid. I think there's going to be, I just think monetarily speaking. And so, this is where it really comes down to, right? There's so many challenges of sending humans to Mars and getting them back, right? You have just all these really small irritants, even like how long you can store food that you can eat, right? Years at a time you need. People and astronauts have to not go crazy. We have to do psychological studies. We don't know. We're starting to learn more about the psychology and physiological impacts of humans in space for incredibly long amounts of time. All of these things need to be solved. That takes money. It takes patience. And at the moment, unless SpaceX becomes an incredibly profitable company, I have a hard time seeing how they are independently able to fund their own human exploration program to Mars. And so at the moment, the only entities capable of marshaling those types of resources, and particularly sustained resources, are governments. And I think you'll see NASA taking this. This is the real role. This is, I believe, Lori Garver, everyone's favorite deputy administrator of NASA, always talked about this, of government riding point, which is a really nice analogy, kind of metaphor when cycling. Government kind of rides point, and people draft off of that. They kind of lead the way. And SpaceX is going to be able to benefit from the work that NASA's done in the past. SpaceX might be able to help some sort of hybrid way of providing hardware and technical expertise that might lower the cost for a NASA-led mission. But I really think just, again, the amounts of resources it's going to take to get to Mars, you can't count out government, and I just have a hard time seeing SpaceX doing that on its own.
Casey Dreier is the Director of Space Policy for the Planetary Society, joins me via Skype. Casey, thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure to be here. Fun talking.
Be sure to check out Casey's article, as well as more great stuff from the Planetary Society online. It's at planetary.org. That's it for this episode. Support for Are We There Yet comes from the listeners of WMFE. You can follow the show online. We're on Twitter at AWTYMars, or reach out to me in the Twitterverse. I'm at SpaceBrendan. Are We There Yet is a production of WMFE. Our theme music was composed by Kevin McLeod. You can find more space news online at WMFE.org/space. I'm Brendan Byrne. Thanks for listening.